Hello to all of my viewers and listeners, and I'm very honoured this evening to have Seán McKiernan. Seán is a native of County Monaghan, but now resides in Sligo, and he's a psychologist. He's an author. He's a former teacher. He's a very fine public speaker. I've been at some of his seminars in the past, and he's also a poet. So you're very welcome, Seán.
Thank you very much, Sean.
Seán, maybe I know you're a native of County Monaghan. I know you have some very famous siblings in the political realm, but maybe you'd like to explain a little bit more about your background, please, and where you're from.
Yeah, well, I come from Carrickmacross in South Monaghan, and my father was a hard-working painting and decorator. Also a very artistic man. There was a time when 12 shop fronts on the main street in Carrickmacross were painted by my father. I held his ladder as a teenager, and he used to do the gold leaf script. It could take him 2 weeks to do the sign. Nowadays, I think it's all been replaced by stickers and PVC. He was a man who could grain a door or French polish the banisters. And he was a busy man with contracts. He would do the priest's house every year. He did the convent. I put putty in the windows of the highest window in the Louis convent. He had a lot of contracts. There was a time when he was working with BP and Shell. Every petrol pump, every island, every girder was painted by himself, myself, my brother Vincent P, and a few other painters that travelled and stayed overnight all around Ireland. A hard-working man, worked very hard to provide for us. My mother was a nurse, and she was someone who looked after the elderly people in RD hospital for most of her life. And sadly, both of them were lost too soon to terminal cancer. And in my father's instance, it was esophageal cancer, which was a terrible one. And my mother, pancreatic cancer. So we lost our parents sooner than we should have. My brother, Vincent P., was a political hack from very early days, and is now a senator with the Green Party. And my sister, Catherine, is a minister in the Irish government for arts, culture, and all the rest of it. I think if my parents came back from the dead, they wouldn't know what happened. Because my sister wasn't that involved at all in politics. She wasn't involved in politics. She's now a minister of government. And I think they never thought Vincent would ever get his goal. But he's very happy in the Oireachtas now in the Seanad. I was never into politics, really. My sister, by the way, Leona, is the eldest. She emigrated in the 1980s to America. As a nurse, she couldn't get a job in the 80s. But I was never into politics. I went for the secure pension job as a teacher, and I taught for nearly the guts of 11 years. Most of it in Our Lady's Secondary School in Castleblaney. And there was a special class there, which I used to head up and help. And I think I got a love for psychology. A lot of psychologists used to come in to advise me about the kids and the needs that the kids had. And there was part of me that was interested in psychology from that. And after 11 years of teaching, I decided to give it up and go back to university to pursue psychology.
Very good, Seán. And I can appreciate some of what you said there in terms of your father's work, because my father was and still is a monumental sculptor, and would put 23.5 carat gold leaf onto headstones.
Yeah, okay.
And I'm well aware it's a painstaking and a long process, and it requires good weather, etc. So it's just interesting you brought that up, because it's something I can identify with. I suppose, Seán, any theories as to why you're such a high achieving family? I know you talked about that very strong work ethic that your parents had, and obviously they transposed it onto you. But any other theories, or would you care to speculate?
Yeah, it's interesting. They definitely valued education. Like my father was a hardworking painter, but he was self-employed, and he had his challenging times as well. When BP and Shell decided to use stickers and PVC pumps And, you know, plastic signs, that was the end of the contract that the Martins had. And we literally did every BP and Shell station throughout the 26 counties. And a lot of people started painting their own homes. You know, like there was a time when you got the Martins, there were the 7th generation of painters in Carrickmacross, my father. And he would have always been of the opinion that, you know, self-employment was not the way to go. That if you could get a permanent pensionable job, and my mother would say also incremental, that's the one to go for. And I don't know why I picked education, but I fell into it by accident. I liked Irish, so I did a degree in Irish and history, and I was having a great time in college with my 5 or 6 friends that we were living with at the time. And I think one of them said, you can do a H-dip. And I said, what's the H-dip? They said, it's another year that makes you a qualified teacher. And I said, well, another year here, I'm all on for that. I just said, we can party for another year. So I think I became a teacher by accident, really. But then I discovered that, you know, at that time, I says, God, you know, if I pursue it, I might get a car. I could get a car loan.
Yes.
And I probably fell into it for the wrong reasons, really, but I grew to love it. And I loved teaching. And I think I shocked people when I resigned. And you don't have to change because you have to, if you know what I'm saying. People often say, were you unhappy as a teacher? Were you stressed as a teacher? I said, no, I just wanted to do something different. And I think a lot of people do the same thing for too long. You know, you see it in sport, you see it in music. You have to change sometimes. You have to refresh yourself. So I just felt that I wanted a new challenge. So psychology was in the back of my head. I said, why not try psychology? I knew it would take at least 5 years to convert into it. So I'd have to negotiate that with my wife, because at least 2 years of it I'd have no salary. And
yeah, you're kind of anticipating my next question there, Shane, which was, you know, what was this 5 years not working, or you know, so obviously there was kind of a leap of faith there to some extent.
There was. I suppose my wife was very supportive of me. But it may not have worked out. I could have invested those 5 years and not have got a job as a psychologist at all. I know a lot of people who, you know, studied psychology and never got a job. And not only that, but we had a home and a mortgage. And my wife at that time was a secondary school teacher in the Louis in Monaghan, and very happy there. And, you know, to justify the investment of money and resources and time into that qualification, I probably would have had to apply for jobs in Limerick, Cork, England. Do you know what I mean? So I was exceptionally lucky. And I often feel we forget how blessed we are. Like, wonderful things happen to everybody. And we're much better at remembering the bad things, which also happen. If you could remember the good things more often, you'd be in much better form more often, I often say. But as soon as I qualified as a psychologist, Seán, the perfect job appeared in the newspaper. Now, there was no guarantee I'd get it, but, you know, it might take every 10 years before you'd see a job in your own backyard. And I applied for it and I got it. So that was an amazing thing to happen. You know, and that was with National Learning Network, part of Rehab Group at the time. And I was based in Monaghan town, where we just had built our new home. And I would visit Cavan, Louth and Meath, meeting the people that I wanted to help. Because at the end of the day, that's why I became a psychologist. I wanted to help the people who had taken some kind of hit in life, to steer them back to wellness again. That's why I became a psychologist in the first instance.
Brilliant, Shane. Shane, I want to pivot back there to a few things you've touched on, about how your father, I suppose, had a kind of guaranteed business until the times changed and processes changed in terms of signage and what it was made from, etc. And I also think then about the career change you took, albeit on a voluntary basis. And you moved from one thing you loved a great deal to something else you found you had a new passion for. Yeah. And I suppose I tend to help a lot of prospective job applicants in terms of getting interview ready. And I think at the moment, particularly in the tech sector, there's been a lot of churn recently, a lot of redundancies, or indeed proposed redundancies, a lot of uncertainty. What advice would you have to people who find themselves in that situation where they have been made redundant, or where there is that paralyzing fear stalking their workplace, stalking the canteen of potential redundancies, and who will be picked?
Well, I think we can be our own best friend or our own worst enemy in times of crisis. And since the beginning of time, there have always been people who can cope brilliantly with challenges. Like there were people who survived the concentration camps of World War II, for instance, and they lived a long, happy, successful life anyway. Some people coped brilliantly with the pandemic. They're afraid to say so because they're in a minority. For the rest of us, we found it very challenging. There's people who can keep health and hurt in the same room brilliantly. There's people who are made redundant and take it personally and they give up. And there's other people who find a better job for themselves. So I think there always have been people who cope brilliantly with adversity. And the single biggest mistake that psychology made is that we forgot to interview those people. We were only interviewing the people who shattered to pieces in crisis. Now, it's great that we've done that because we can help them. But the science of the survivor is an intriguing science, and maybe it should have been on the curriculum. Like, for instance, I meet people who might have got well over 500 points in their Leaving Cert. They might have been put up on a stage for head prefect or student of the year, yet they crumbled to pieces during their first crisis and first term in university. So why we have certain people who are better at coping than others is not the most important topic. The most important topic is, what are they doing that makes the difference? Because we can copycat them and steal their ideas for ourselves. But one thing that resilient people never have is a fear of failure. And I think when you have a fear of failure, you won't try. And I think children should be taught how to fail and how to fail properly. Because if you're not trying, you're totally helpless. And a lot of people like that who are made redundant or who are put out of their jobs, it's very, very easy to conclude that that's me frigged or that's me finished for life. But that's not the most, I suppose, helpful way of making that conclusion at the time. Like, we should never underestimate our potential to change. And in every given crisis, there's an opportunity to learn. And just because you have lost a job, like there's people who have a job and they're very unhappy in it. Like, so just because you've lost a job doesn't mean you can't be happier in another one. And the sad thing about a lot of us is that we have strengths that we don't know we have. So I suppose I didn't know I might be a relatively effective psychologist until I became a psychologist. So you have to try things, you have to speculate to accumulate, you have to give it a shot. But if you're afraid of failing, you don't try, because that governs you. And temporary setbacks should always be translated as that, temporary setbacks on the way to future success. That's what they should be seen as, because we all encounter setbacks, disappointments, and failure, but it doesn't mean we can't keep trying. So anyone who's in a situation like that has to be open-minded. Like, a lot of us are very closed-minded in crisis. Like, a lot of us are know-alls when we're stressed. And the one thing you don't do with a know-all is tell them that they're a know-all, or you double the volume of the row. I often use questions as tools. And, and sometimes self-discovery is the gold dust of recovery as well. So, there's no point in telling people what's wrong with them, what caused it, or what to do next. I think if I ask intelligent questions, maybe the penny might drop. But you have teachers who maybe shouldn't be teaching. You have nurses who don't have the gift of compassion and aren't happy in their job. You have potentially fantastic artists who aren't involved in anything to do with art, but they're paying their bills with something else that they're doing. So I think probably, I think, the single greatest failure of school is its failure to assess kids for their strengths. Because if we all know, like, for instance, like, I'm quite good at antique clock repair, but it's only in the last 3 years that I discovered that I can do that, because I did a residential course for a weekend in Clare on how to repair an old antique clock. Like, my parents thought I was an academic, but I might have been a woodwork teacher if I tried that. Do you know what I'm saying? So I think you have to have an open mind, and you have to be willing to change and try things and speculate. And sometimes we're very rigid, very, we don't want it black or white thinking instead of grey thinking, because there's thousands of shades of grey.
No, again, I appreciate what you're saying there, Shane, towards the end. And I suppose, again, as I said, I as well as preparing candidates for interview, I also sit in a lot of interview panels. And I suppose I'm trying to think of diplomatic language amongst maybe older people on interview panels or retired people on interview panels. There can be a skepticism about people who have moved employment a great deal. Whereas with younger people and millennials, etc., whom I might be coaching for interview, they take great pride in that. They take great pride in their mobility. They take great pride in only going to companies, applying to companies, and being employed by companies who kind of align with their values, etc. Now, that can make it sometimes harder to find a job, but it's an interesting kind of generational shift, and it's something, I admire that they have that self-confidence. Something occurred to me, Shane, as you're speaking there about resilience and about our education system. Sport, I think, teaches a great deal of resilience to young people, but unfortunately, competitive sport means that a lot of people will be sitting on the sideline. What do you think of that point, or how can we maybe make sport more inclusive?
Yeah, well, structured daily exercise rivals antidepressants in most studies. And if I was the Minister for Education, I would quadruple the amount of PE in schools in an instant. And I'd watch with glee as anxiety rates would dramatically drop among young people. But we're still obsessed with academic things. And I think that the difficulty with sports sometimes in school is where it becomes an elite profession early on. So you might have an emphasis on Gaelic football, but it's whether you're on the Cornanog panel or the Ranafast panel, that becomes the obsession. And if you make the panel, you get special kit bags and special tracksuits with your name on them, and you become a hero among your year group. And sometimes you have maybe a panel of 25 kids, but the 26th and 27 just missed it, just barely missed it. But they might be students whose head stoops, they give up on that sport completely because it was pitched that way to them. It was pitched as, the goal is to represent your school, to put the jersey on, and to win competitions. And I think sport has to be much more than that. And I think sport is something which should be enjoyable. I'm not against competitions, but we need to include all kids in competitions if we're going to do it that way. So I'm always asking when I'm in a school, who looks after the B team and the C team? And do they get special kit bags and tracksuits with their names on them as well? And sadly, in most schools, there's no B or C team at all. So it's only the elite, the people who kick the ball forward us from a dead ball scenario, or who save the most balls and goals, they get elevated to the stage. But that can happen in other aspects of school too. Like you might have a brilliant harpist, you might have a fantastic singer, but they're never in the Christmas concert, and they mightn't have the lead role in the play because they don't study music. And the music teacher is in charge of the play. So there can be great injustices in schools sometimes. Likewise with prefects. Like sometimes there's this horrendous system where prefects are appointed within a staff room, or worse again, where students vote for prefects. And I would be against both of those systems, because I think leadership is something that you learn. You don't appoint a leader at 16 years of age. And I'd prefer a system where, every student has the opportunity to learn how to lead, and even with a trial contract. And if you like it, would you like to stay on as a prefect, rather than this elitism again, where teachers decide who they think is the leader. And in many cases, sometimes the so-called leaders disappoint in that, they're the ones that are suspended after Christmas, or brought alcohol in and broke all the rules. And, there could have been other kids there who should have been given a chance. So I think there can be great injustice within education. You can have a child who's very intelligent, who leaves school thinking that they're slow. And an independent IQ test will prove them to be as bright, if not brighter, than most who were in their year group at the time. That's a fact. But they leave due to their experiences. Yeah.
I suppose from my own time in school, I can visualize those types of people. And from serving on different boards of management, having them on an ETB, again, I can see those types of young people. There's a greater emphasis now on traineeships and apprenticeships, not just in the traditional areas, but in professional areas as well. I think of insurance, for example, but there are others. I think there's now efforts to develop traineeships and apprenticeships in the HR area as well.
Yeah.
Is that something we should be doing more of?
Yes, I think, Seán, no doubt. I think everybody deserves a chance. And the system hasn't changed that much. It's still 7 subjects at the end of 6 years. Some kids are doing subjects that they hate and that they're no good at. But at the end of the day, at the end of the 6 years, it comes down to 3 weeks in June, where you must regurgitate what you have learned in the previous couple of months, in the run up to that, in the revision. And you must get it on the paper within a set time frame. And I think that's very unfair, because some kids will be naturally good at that. But they mightn't be able to clinch a deal in the business world with their 500 points. And I just think it's wrong. And the reason why we have that system is because people aspire to go into university. I'd love to get rid of the Leaving Cert completely. That's what I would do. I don't think I'll ever get into politics, because I'd never be allowed to be the Minister for Education. But I would scrap the Leaving Cert completely, and I'd allow everybody to try whatever they want. So I'd make the theatre halls bigger in the universities. And if somebody at 17 or 18 wishes to pursue medicine, I'd allow them try it, or psychology, or engineering, or veterinary. And I think the system will find them out in the end. After 5 or 6 months, they'd know it's too hard for me, this. This is not what I thought it was. And it's quite a revolutionary concept. But I think it would take away from the stresses of the Leaving Cert as well. And you'd probably have more people in jobs that they are good at and that they like.
But I think in America, and you have a lot of kind of college degrees that are quite general, and you don't specialize then until you have your college degree and you do postgraduate. I mean, I think law is a postgraduate field of study in America. It's something you do after you've attained a primary degree in something else. The other thing that occurs to me, Shane, as you're talking, is that in a lot of secondary schools, you've a few weeks of sampling all the different practical courses.
I like the idea of that now. Yeah.
So it's not unlike what you're saying, but applied to a third level context.
Yeah. And Seán, just for you to know that there are some people who can afford to go to a country in Europe, a number of countries, and they can pursue one of the elite professions without being asked about their points at all. And they can afford to do the course in that other country. And they're not going to be less a vet or less a doctor than anybody else, because it's doing the course. But it's a wee bit unjust. It's not very fair on people who can't afford to do courses in those countries, where you're not asked about whether you have 500 or 600 points. So that's a route to some of those elite professions. And I think everybody should be allowed to try whatever they think they'll be good at. Because I'll tell you why, for most of our life, we work and sleep. And if you're unhappy in your work, you're probably not sleeping either. So I think it's very, very important to find yourself in a job that you like. And I like being a psychologist at the moment, but I haven't signed a life contract. I like the arts as well. And maybe, after a couple of years, I might pursue something even for less a salary in the arts field, because we only live this life once. And a lot of us have this thing that you must find your vocation at 15, 16, 17 years of age. You must put yourself through this exam structure. You must get your points up on the board, and then you graduate, and then you're stuck with this forever. I think we need to be more innovative, and we need to take a helicopter view about how we live our life, because I think getting that bit right is critically important. Like, there could be nurses who don't care as much as they used to, and they're not any less a human being, but they're probably not as happy as they used to be in the job that they're doing in the hospital. You could have a teacher, and I often ask the question of, an English teacher, do you teach the curriculum or do you teach them a love of poetry? It's a different question. Likewise with art,
or a love of essay writing,
something. Or are you just delivering the curriculum and trying to get points up on the board with your students because you want to have good results, and because you'll be perceived as a good teacher once you get good results? That pressure's on teachers as well as students and on parents. It's a horrible system. And a lot of kids have mental health difficulties as a consequence of that, because the crash, or they don't do as good as expected. The stress of the expectations raised by parents and by teachers, and when you go into the real world, you discover how ill-equipped you are for scenarios in the real world, which the education system didn't get you ready for at all in this obsession with academic things.
And of course, there's different pathways. People can do PLC courses, which will get them into colleges. So there are alternative methods. When you're a mature applicant, when you're over the age of 23, no one cares what your points were anyway.
No, the back door. The back door is a good door, Seán. I would have gone into psychology the back door. That's the way I come into psychology. But I'm a chartered psychologist. I'm the same as the person who came in the front door. Do you know what I mean? So I think that's what I was talking at the very beginning.
And you've life experience as well to draw on in your work.
Yeah. An open mind is a great thing. When you consider all possibilities, where you're not a know-all, where you let people advise you, where you consult with loads of people. A lot of us are more closed-minded than we know, and we rule out wonderful opportunities that could happen because we think we know best ourselves. And sometimes we don't know best ourselves. Sometimes we have to contemplate other possibilities as well as the one that we think is the only one in our heads.
Yeah, I mean, personally speaking, I've always found it very useful to have a network of people to draw upon in different disciplines and in general for kind of general life advice, but particularly in certain disciplines or certain areas. Be it, in my case, it might be politics, it might be broadcasting, it might be recruitment, it might be mediation, etc. But to have a bank of people you can draw on, and run ideas by. Shane, you have some very interesting theories. I'm sure there will be some teachers roaring at the two of us over what you've said. I suppose we have to go back to the present moment, and at the moment we still do have a Leaving Cert. And it's a Leaving Cert that exerts a great deal of pressure on young people and on their parents, and can cause a lot of havoc in households around this time of year. Have you any advice, I suppose, primarily for students, but also maybe for their parents in regard to the Leaving Cert and getting ready for it in a few weeks' time?
Well, if you don't know where you're going in life, you're going nowhere in particular. And a lot of students drift. Like, you have a lot of students who are very good students. They attend school and they do their homework. But in order to have sufficient motivation levels, when it comes to this cruel exam of 7 subjects, and again, I think even if we only had 2, it'd be a much better system, the 2 you like best and the 2 you're best at. But in a system like that, it has to have some meaning to you. So I often, when I meet Leaving Certs, sometimes I address Leaving Certs, and they're in, particularly if they're in the same room as me, I say, hands up those people who know where they want to be next October if all works out okay for you. And I'm not exaggerating. Maybe 1/3 don't put their hands up. So I think those people are at a huge disadvantage in terms of motivation. It doesn't have any meaning for them. If I was appointed as a psychologist for the Dublin senior football team, surely I wouldn't have to ask anyone at the first training session, what do you want to achieve this year? I'd be so disappointed if I had to give them a hint. Do you know what I mean? Like, you have to know what you want, or you won't get anything. You have to know what you want. So I think they should know what they want. They should discuss that as to whether it's realistic with the guidance counsellor or other teachers that they get on well about. They have to figure out how this will work, how many points they need. And they need to have an option B and an option C, because you don't always get what you want in life. And I think sometimes a second and a third option in terms of aspirational, I suppose, dreams and things is a good idea too. So that's the first thing. And a lot of kids are just working away, but they don't know what they want. The second thing is that it is a stressful scenario. Like, it's not fair that you have to do 7 subjects. That's what we often have to deal with, things we don't like. That's the way life works. So you have to take an approach to a challenge like that. And you need discipline, so you need study periods, but you also need to watch your diet. Like, a lot of teenagers come in on an empty stomach. Yet all the clinical research shows that those students who have a breakfast perform better, they last the pace longer. Their memory and concentration span is enhanced by the fact that they have ate and the others don't eat. Now, some kids say to me they don't feel like eating at 8:30 in the morning. Sometimes you have to do what you don't feel like doing as well. Do you know what I mean? So diet is massively important. And I think regular meals and good quality meals, so important. Sleep. I think like when I was younger, it was much easier to go to bed because we only had one television, 2 stations. There's now a television in every room with hundreds of stations, and a smartphone and an iPad, an Xbox and a PlayStation. Like, when I went to bed, I went to bed. You might read a magazine for a little while, but there was nothing else. When you went to bed, you went to bed. And I think a lot of kids now are on their phones at 1 a.m, and their parents are snoring next door. So they're not getting a proper night's sleep. They're not recharging their batteries. And that's not good either. So they need to have a discipline around when study finishes and when I go to bed, and stick with that. And sometimes kids take things too seriously, and they're sick of the Leaving Cert being discussed at home, being discussed at school, and all they're doing is being consumed by it. I think a hobby is hugely important. I think we all need to get away from the stress. And when you are doing something that you love doing, be that reading a book, be it playing the banjo, be it weeding the garden, you enter what's called a state of psychological flow, where you lose consciousness of time, where you lose sense of yourself, others, and the world around you. So, like, you could be reading a novel and all of a sudden you smell the burnt dinner. Like, I'm sorry about the burnt dinner, but I'm very happy with what's happening to your brain for those 40 minutes. All the right parts are lighting up, and there's no anxiety, there's no worry. You've gone into a neutral place. And a hobby does that for you. And they're the things we give up. As we grow older, we give up the hobbies that we loved. And sometimes students in their Leaving Cert year do that as well. Like, okay, you can't play competitive basketball because it's 3 nights a week, but you shouldn't stop bouncing the ball. If you like the cinema, you should go to the cinema once a week, whether you're doing the Leaving Cert or not. You need a night off. You need to throw yourself into a fantasy and forget about points and universities. So you need that hobby as well.
And Shane, then the role parents can play, because it can be incredibly positive or it can be incredibly negative. What advice would you give to parents who are maybe caring too much, or maybe are too hands off and caring too little?
Yeah, well, I think parents sometimes the biggest I suppose some things we don't like to embrace as home truths, but I think when particularly teenage years, you've no control. And a lot of parents make the mistake of trying to have full control. But as children grow older, they want to become themselves. And like when I was a teenager, I was listening to punk rock. I was into the Sex Pistols and the Clash. I was singing songs about let's bring an end to the world now, if not even sooner. I'd say my parents were very afraid of the whole scenario. But if my parents had started to listen to punk rock, I would have gone classical. In that I wanted to be everything other than my parents. I was finding my own feet. And that can freak parents out. And that sometimes we try to control. And of course, there have to be rules and regulations. You can't have a child coming home drunk at 16 years of age. And boundaries and time and, in terms of and where you are and all of that. There has to be certain agreements about that. But you won't be picking the boyfriend for your son or your daughter. And likewise, you won't be picking the boyfriend or girlfriend for your son or daughter, whatever way they are. They will find their own person. And you shouldn't be trying to pick their career for them either. I think if you're doing that, that's a dangerous thing to do, because you could end up being very unhappy in their 30s and they might end up blaming you for steering them that direction. And maybe they should have been a dancer, or they should have been writing plays instead of medicine, but you steered them towards medicine. So I think parents have to acknowledge that they don't have full control, but the one thing they can do is they can influence with in a very subtle way, by being there, by listening, and by not judging, and by allowing people to have their emotions. Like, everybody's entitled to their emotions. No one has a right to say you shouldn't feel angry, you shouldn't feel sad about this. If someone's saying they're sad or angry, that should be validated. And we should listen to why your son and daughter is sad or angry or happy. That's relevant content. And I think sometimes parents are dismissive of teenagers and their emotions. And sometimes parents try to tell them how things are instead of helping them to discover how things are with very good questions. Like, I remember a teenager telling me once at a wedding table that she was leaving school. She was switching schools because everybody in her class hated her guts. And I says, God, I says, that's dreadful. I says, but you were happy in first year and second year. Yeah, but she's, now I want to leave because everybody hates my guts. But she was smiling when I asked her what kind of research methodology did she use to come to that conclusion. Did you survey all the first years, I said, and the second years and the third years? Did you hand in the questionnaire of hatred to the staff room? What percentage rate was the hatred? 86, 72? And what transpired was not that everybody hated her guts, but that she wasn't getting on with 3 people in her class. So, a parent needs to listen. So rather than agreeing or disagreeing, to hear the story and to validate the emotions, and not to cheese your child off by, of course, you know more about living because you're living longer than your 15-year-old, but they don't want to hear that. It might be better to ask them, is it true? How do you know that's true? Is it fair to say that? Is it logical? What's the evidence? A lot of us join the dots without knowing, actually. So I think it's important to keep that link with our children and to talk openly with them is a great thing. If your child is talking to you, even if you're disagreeing about what you're talking about, that's very good.
It's half the battle, or maybe more.
Oh, it is. And if someone says to you, I've decided I'm going to be a communist, or I'm an anarchist, I've decided anarchy is the way to go, rather than saying, don't be so stupid, Rory, what a stupid idea, discuss anarchy with your child and explain to me why you think anarchy is a better way than a democracy. That's the way to go. Do you know?
I suppose, Shane, one of the things that's occurring to me as I'm listening to you is that old adage about we've two ears and one mouth, but also that I suppose a lot of people listen in order to figure out what they're going to say in terms of giving advice, etc. It's not genuine listening. And kind of, I'm reminded of that a lot when I hear you speak. So Shane, another thing you have touched on or alluded to during the course of our time together is the importance of utilizing your talents and following things that interest you. And I suppose I'm just curious to know, when did the poet Seán McKiernan emerge?
Well, I loved poetry at school. I had a very good poetry teacher. And when I was 16 or 17, I had a typewriter, and I used to type my poems because I liked looking at them typed. And my favorite poet at the time was, Dylan Thomas, a Welsh poet. I also like Thomas Kinsella, who edits his poems. You can read a Thomas Kinsella poem, and there might be changes in it in 6 or 7 years from the first. He changes poems, but and I like Patrick Kavanagh, of course. It wasn't that gone on Yeats. I thought he was too hard to understand, but I always loved poetry at school, so I liked it. And I think one of the most exciting things that happened was when I was 18, I paid a typist to type a collection of poems that I wrote called Stilling the Dance of Time. And I entered them when I was at university. I entered some of my poems for competitions at university level, and they were published. And I think that's why I'm saying about kids being affirmed, or when you're given opportunities to lead. But when you submit poetry to a journal and it's published, you're acknowledged as a writer. So you're inclined to write more. God, I mustn't be as bad as I thought I was, or there must be something in this, so I'm going to write more. I'm going to try to get a better poem than that one for the next magazine. And then I brought out a book called The Dark Room. Oh, God, it must be 20 years ago. And I remember being asked to read poems from it at the Patrick Kavanagh Festival, which again was lovely affirmation from my home county. And I remember thinking, I'm sitting up in a stool here with an audience looking at me, and all I'm doing is talking about my vulnerabilities in verse, and people like it. They've actually paid in. Wouldn't it be wonderful if this paid my mortgage? It's a much nicer job. Poetry doesn't pay your mortgage. If you stood in Easton's or Waterstones and watched the poetry section for a full day, very few people go over. And if they do, it's usually a diehard who might buy 2 or 3. But I had a book of poetry called The Dark Room. Then I brought out one called Stilling the Dance of Time. And then I just before COVID struck, I had a book called Thin Lines, which I was I had intended to go around Ireland with in the theatres to mix poetry with psychology and storytelling and humour. Because I had done that in the Intas, and I couldn't get over. I sold out the Intas. I sold out the Hawkswell Theatre in Sligo twice. I sold out the Black Box in Belfast. It was an amazing thing to achieve, an unknown poet like me mixed with psychology. But COVID stopped it. And I suppose I have to think about it again, because the publisher wants the book sold. And I might have to give it a push and go around the theatres again in the coming months or in the next year or so, because you can't, I suppose, sell a book unless you're publicising the book, really,
Another thing that was suspended during COVID, Shane, and that you're relaunching is your public speaking work and your seminar work. And I know that you had a very successful Live Life Well event in Sligo. And you're proposing to have another one on Saturday, May 27th in the lovely surroundings of Fitzpatrick Castle Hotel in Killiney. And I think it's a half-day seminar. It's valued at €75. Would you just maybe, because obviously it's important to promote things, in case there are people watching and listening who might be interested in that event, maybe what can people expect from that? Why should they go?
Well, what drew me into psychology was wanting to help people. I told you that at the very beginning. I felt sorry for people who lost their wellness. But the more I was in that job, the more I began to realize that a lot of people should never have ended up speaking to me in the first place, in that psychology was coming in far too late. And I was being paid a handsome salary to tell people what was wrong with them, what caused it, and what to do next. And the single biggest mistake that psychology made, it's made a few, is that it obsessed itself with illness at the expense of truly understanding wellness. So it's a scientific fact that if you go to the psychology section in any library, over 90% of the books in that section are about the things we never want to get: deficits, disadvantages, disorders, and diseases. But psychology can also be utilized to sow the seeds of mental wellness, not just understanding mental illness. And that was the psychology which drew me out of clinical work. So when I started first, I only worked with people who were unwell. Now I don't work with people at all who are unwell. All I do is give out the best psychology to everybody without asking questions, because you shouldn't have to wait until you take a hit to get psychology. So those seminars are where I teach people from a scientific perspective how to be healthier, how to be happier, and how to be more resilient. And the ideas I share are not my ideas. They're from cross-cultural research. So there may be people who are more likely to live longer from a health perspective. Like my father-in-law is 90 years of age. He smoked all his life and all he got was yellow fingers. So genetics can play tricks in terms of positive or negative outcomes. You could be a long liver anyway. You could live for, no matter what, you could be carrying weight or everything, you're going to live it. But you can lengthen your life. You can give yourself a better quality of life. And that's why we teach things like diet and management of stress. We teach people about exercise now, particularly at schools, because those interventions give you a better chance of living a better quality of life and to live longer. We haven't been doing much on happiness. And likewise, you'll never be happy all the time. And the truth is, we'll encounter a lot of unhappiness in our lifetimes because that's the way life works. But you're entitled to as much happiness as you can humanly get. That's my view. Mm-hmm. And if psychology can give you ideas for achieving a high average score for happiness during your lifetime, well, I think that's better than wishing, hoping, and praying for happiness. You need to take a scientific perspective. And the people that we alluded to in this conversation earlier on, the people who coped brilliantly with the pandemic, the people who bounced back quickly from setbacks and disappointments, these resilient people, we have interviewed them in the last 38 years worldwide, and we know what they're doing. So you can steal their ideas for ourselves. You can copycat them and give yourself a better chance. That's much better than just keeping your fingers crossed in crisis. So in the Live Life Well seminars, I give the best I have learned to the audience without asking questions. And that's what I was doing before the pandemic arrived. That was my bread and butter. That's right. So I was going around the whole of Ireland doing these. And the one in Sligo was the first that I'd done since the pandemic. And I was hoping I'd get a crowd because I love doing this and it's important work. And I'm delighted to say that the crowds are as good, if not a little bit better, than they were before the pandemic. So there's always an interest in what I do. I'll probably do about 8 of them altogether, north, south, east, and west. And it's lovely meeting people again, Seán, rather than being just on Zoom the whole time, which I was for 2 years. It's lovely meeting people and talking to people, particularly afterwards. So
as I go out to public events, that is something that is a consistent trend. People are glad to be going to meetings again, be it political meetings, be it functions, fundraisers, family gatherings, etc. You know, people are glad that those things are back on the agenda.
Thank God.
Indeed, I second that. Shane, I suppose the pandemic was genuinely dreadful for a lot of people in terms of death, in terms of suffering COVID, in terms of suffering long COVID, in terms of maybe losing their fitness and their mobility because they were housebound, because they were of an age group that has been encouraged to remain at home, etc. So I'm kind of acknowledging all of the negatives of the pandemic at the outset of this question. What positives came from it? And I suppose I'm thinking maybe that people kind of became more active in a lot of cases. They were outside walking to kind of keep their sanity. There was a greater appreciation of remote working and the possibility that this type of technology gave remote working. I mean, the technology was there before the pandemic, but the pandemic made us realize its value. Those are kind of some of the positive things that I see from the pandemic. Would you like to echo those, or are there any that are?
Yeah, I think so. I think the one little thing that concerns me at the moment is that it's great to have the pandemic behind us. I think the World Health Organization are about to declare it as over officially soon. Like, I'm delighted about that, but I'm concerned about people pressing the reset button and plugging back in as if it never happened. I don't think that's intelligent. And there was a famous psychologist called John Dewey who said, you don't learn from life experiences. You learn from reflecting on life experiences. And I think we need to reflect more. Like, the pandemic did happen. Like, we lost people. Like, there were people who didn't get a proper funeral. There were people who waved goodbyes outside in the hospital car park through a frosted window to their mother or father as they were dying. There were nurses who, I suppose, had to deal with that situation as a new part of their job, using iPads, to show them, the people outside saying goodbye to them. Like, the trauma of that alone. Like, I was speaking to cancer nurses recently, and they told me that there's more people presenting with cancer that shouldn't be, because they were neglected during the pandemic. Those cancer nurse specialists were doing vaccines instead, because that's what we did. The pandemic was a horrendous time. There were kids who graduated on Zoom. There were weddings that didn't take place, or big weddings became tiny weddings. Like, I remember a wonderful principal here, Father Kevin Early from Summerhill College, died. He would have filled a cathedral in Sligo. He didn't get that. So we can't pretend that didn't happen. I think we have to have a look at our life. I think that's the one, and to ask ourselves, what kind of a life do we want to live? And the greatest single contradiction about us human beings is that we often wait till we lose things before we realize that there were treasures in the first instance. So it's when we lost the right to visit somebody or have people over, when we lost the right to have music in a lounge bar or a concert in a public theatre, when we lost those things, we start giving out about them. But I know this for a fact, that we used to say social distancing goes against the grain of who we are as humans. That it was constantly being said. And like, I get that. But the truth is, we weren't good at social connection anyway. So, like, houses have never been as close to each other, and people have never been further apart. Like, there were kids, and I've learned this where I live now, they're the same age as each other. I learned this during the lockdowns, and they don't know each other's names. It seems if you wear a different school uniform, that's the reason. When I was their age, I knew everybody on my road to kick ball with. Didn't matter what gender, what age. But, we ended up, I suppose, that generation stuck in screens. I think, good things happened. But the greatest thing that could ever happen from this pandemic is where you're reminded of a truth that's there since the beginning of time. And that truth is, you don't govern the earth. You're just passing through. And you're living one life, very special life. And you should have a serious look at that. The people in your life, the things you want to do, your sense of purpose. I think that'd be wonderful if we're having conversation, if we're reflecting on it and making, I suppose, our life a better life as a consequence of it, a more meaningful life. That'd be fantastic.
Shane, there's quite a lot of stuff you've covered, and I mean, that's quite a good perspective on the pandemic. I suppose, what can we take out of it? And I do think a lot of people reprioritize their lives in terms of exercise and health, in terms of that social connectivity, which is so important. I suppose, Shane, have you any kind of parting words for listeners or for viewers about how to live life well, to emulate the title of your seminar coming up on May 27th in Killiney?
Well, I always remind people that we're not puppets on strings. We're not fulfilling some kind of prophecy set in stone for us. It's not all genetically predetermined. We have a much bigger say in our life than we acknowledge. And a lot of us get lost in the noise of life. A lot of us spend our lives doing the things we feel we're meant to be doing, rather than living the life we want to live. And a lot of us just work and sleep. There's so much more to your life than that. And when we talk about health and happiness, resilience, like the good news, it's a great news, I think, is that very simple things lie at the heart of those wonderful things like health in a world that's become far too complicated, actually. So it's never too late to turn a corner. It's never too late to embrace a better quality of life. You know, you can colour this day brilliantly with the hours left in it yet. Like tonight could be the best night you've had in years. I often say to people, I dare you, even if you're working in the morning. Like a lot of us let the past throw a shadow over the rest of our lives. And I can understand that, particularly if there's hurts and trauma in the past. But it's a pity. It's a pity for that to happen because you can't change any of the past. You can learn from it. I think that's a good idea. And there's other people who worry about the future. And they have bucket loads of anxiety in their days. Like there was never anything definite about the future. God, the pandemic certainly told us that. But this day is a golden day. Oh, you can do all the right things now. There's no doubt about that. You have no excuses. You can do it right now. And that's my wish, that if you take just this day and live it to the full as a golden day that it is, and get into the habit of doing that with every day, you'll find yourself a lot less stressed.
Well, Shane, I think we've been speaking for the best part of an hour, and I'd happily do another. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure if people listening and viewing would tolerate that. But I want to thank you for your time. You've been very generous with your time. I suppose, as I alluded to, I have been at your seminars before in the distant past, and I would heartily recommend the one that's coming up on the 27th of May in Fitzpatrick's Castle in Killiney to listeners and to viewers. So look, thanks again for the interview. Thanks again
no problem,
for
Seán.
a very challenging but uplifting message. Okay?
Thank you very much, Seán.
Thank you, Shane.